Hello Big Finish listeners, and welcome back to another Torchwood audio drama review. In today's review, I'm going to be taking a look at the April 2024 instalment of the Torchwood monthly range, which is of course entitled Missing Molly, featuring Ianto-Jones, and is written by Ianto-Jones himself, Gareth David Lloyd. Now previously last month, I'd taken a look at the first instalment of this trilogy, being Tube Strike, also featuring Tommy from Torchwood 1, and rather excitingly, the return of the Weevils. Now I imagine if you are particularly a fan of Ianto, no doubt you are already on it with these releases and probably have already listened to them, but if you are a fan of Ianto and you haven't listened to this series as of yet, I definitely recommend doing so. These stories are another perfect example of the capabilities of the audio drama format and the storytelling that you can do within it. I think this episode is so brilliantly immersive because the characters just leap off the page, and it's another wonderful audio drama that you can just set everyday life aside and get fully engrossed within these characters and their rather sad backstories. And before I do get into the nitty-gritty for this one, I would also just like to mention that this release does contain adult material, making it not suitable for younger listeners. It does have a few rather sad themes, including those that go missing in the process of grief, and there is quite a bit of strong language, so yes, headphone listening is certainly advised for this one. And also, if you haven't listened to Tube Strike or have no plans to listen to Tube Strike or even Disco, that's okay, because these are isolated stories, they don't link together or anything like that, very much like the vast majority of the Torchwood main range so far. Now, I've listened to this episode twice. I listened to it when it came out on the day, I do believe it was Thursday, and I'm re-listening to it again on the Sunday, simply just to refresh it in my mind, but also because I really enjoyed the story. And rather oddly, a rather unique thing, in between the two listenings, I did in fact meet Gareth David Lloyd again at Northeast Comic Con, so in Newcastle, which is very nice indeed. I mentioned how much I did enjoy these stories. It was a very brief encounter because it was an incredibly busy day, and I caught him just before he was leaving, just to say I really enjoyed the stories. Yes, he was a very nice presence to be around. So 12 years ago, Molly Morgan went missing from Penarth Pier after her father won her a toy bunny at the fair. Since then, her mother Alison has grieved. Her life has been put on hold, she's turned to alcohol, and her neighbours dislike her quite a lot. Her relationship with Molly's father, Stuart, deteriorated to the point of splitting up, except one day, 12 whole years later, Molly has returned to the doorstep of her family home. And the last thing that she can remember is her day at the fair, and winning her toy bunny, as if it happened yesterday. Gareth David Lloyd has once again penned this one. It's set within what I believe is probably Torchwood Series 1. We have a few little references here and there, so it's set kind of within the events of the TV show itself, rather than a continuation series or anything like that. And it's a really nice jump in time from the previous story, Tube Strike, given that that was set within the Torchwood 1 era alongside Tommy. It depicted Ianto's very first few weeks working for Torchwood, him learning the ropes, and therefore within Missing Molly we are treated to a more experienced version of Ianto. He is here handling her case by himself, but also this one feels a very personal story. I think that Ianto is definitely incorporating his own personal experiences in the way that he responds to the issues within this episode. It's a rather difficult point within his life, because Torchwood Series 1 wasn't the smoothest of rides for Ianto, to say the least, and I like the way that has influenced the events within this story, kind of behind the scenes. What I like is within this episode, I think he sees it as his responsibility to solve the various things that he encounters within this episode, and he doesn't want to particularly get the rest of the team involved. The characters within this story absolutely come alive. Nina Roberts skillfully portrays Alison. The opening scenes provide a grim insight for the listener into her struggling life. She feels incredibly real, broken, but also still on the search for answers all these years later. Whilst Matthew Grevels plays Stuart, he doesn't really appear too much within the story, of course the father of Molly, and yet he impressively sells the character to the listener, which I think is quite difficult given the limited scenes that he has, but I think he definitely has a presence. He makes his presence known throughout this episode, as he has a rather strong personality despite the amount of scenes he actually appears within. He's a rather hard character to like. He's moved on in his life, he's developed his career, he has this wonderful sharpness, but also he's very blunt and sweary, which again offers another insight into the grieving process, and something that I noticed, a very subtle thing on the second listen, which I don't know if this was intentional, where Alison is making coffee for Ianto at the beginning of the story, and she uses instant coffee, and Ianto is very happy to accept this instant coffee. Meanwhile, when he goes to meet Stuart, he mentions, oh, would you like to have this certain bean coffee that is one of the most expensive or something like that, and he's had it from the local deli. So I think those little nods there just show the separation that these two characters have, and the way that they now both lead very, very different lives, one of which has a lot of money and power within the career that he's in, and the other one is certainly struggling to live the day by day. When I first listened to this story, I did think it would have been nice to hear more from Stuart, simply because his background and his life now is so different to Alison's, and that would have been a very intriguing contrast. But then it also makes me think, well, probably if we heard more from Stuart, it would have taken away from Molly and her story, and then it would have also taken away from the many appearances of Ianto and the way that he is weaved into this mystery. And to be honest, I don't want that. I think the rather unusual duo focus on Ianto and Molly within this episode is what makes it so strong. And as I say, I think despite Stuart having a small amount of scenes, he still has an impact, and as a listener, I still felt like he was a three-dimensional character. It shows how many levels there are to the script, and how much thought has gone into bringing these characters alive, but also the living environment they are within. Molly is also a really interesting character. She's the focus of the story, but there is this unsettling presence about her. I found myself kind of captivated by her small stories, those little glimpses into her past. I almost wanted to trip her up as a character, to find little things in her past, like discrepancies that maybe reveal a little bit more about the mystery that is enclosed within this plot. The rather emotional writing certainly kept me on my toes looking for those clues. The piece is set up like a missing person mystery, but with a Torchwood twist. Gwyneth Keyworth as Molly portrays this great range of vulnerability and cold emotion within the character, a child who seems so absent yet still happy to be home. And because of that, you don't particularly trust the character, I think. There's an element of distance, not only between the listener and Molly, but also those who very clearly still love her and have care for her. She's back home, it is this day grieving parent, as in Alison has been dreaming about for so long, and yet perhaps that reuniting moment isn't as magical and as happy perhaps as you would initially perceive. And I think it's really interesting hearing this story go down that route, but also Ianto being thrown into the mix as well. I think it's interesting how, yes, this story is focused around Molly, but I think listening to the way that Ianto interacts with a certain situation, the way that he takes responsibility, the way that he doesn't want to let other people in, he wants to keep this mystery to himself, I think that that is also a really intriguing way to take this story. It goes down a certain path, and in turn I found myself being really focused on Ianto within this episode too, because of the way that he decides to do things. I absolutely continue to appreciate how this range provides nugget-sized glimpses into other people's worlds. Again, coming from a more Doctor Who style story, I think it's quite refreshing, and it's something that I always look forward to each month. What is the Torchwood main range going to do next? Because each individual story is so very different. This range offers heartbreak, emotion, and the grittiness of reality, the ups and downs of life, which I think Doctor Who personally does sugarcoat quite a lot. And I think it's really interesting that when I sort of catch up with friends, in the real world, I'll go out for, say, coffee or whatever, and I'll mention, what I've been, listening to or reading, as you normally do. And I don't really tend to mention the Doctor Who stuff that I listen to, because I know that they won't be interested, because it's sci-fi, they're not really sci-fi fans. But the interesting thing for me, I think, is the amount of times I have brought up a Torchwood story that I've listened to, because it's not always sci-fi, it's not focused on aliens, it's focused around character and humans and their rather difficult lives and the things that they experience. And because of that, I think that this range particularly offers far more than merely just a sci-fi story. I recommend the Torchwood main range to not just Torchwood fans, not just Doctor Who fans, but people as a whole. I think that these are really great stories for anyone to enjoy if you are open to the audio drama format. They have something for everyone, particularly this one, because it doesn't really focus on that sci-fi route. It's just all about the characters and their grieving process and trying to solve this rather interesting mystery. What this trilogy so far has certainly made me realise is that I get along very well with Gareth David Lloyd's form of writing, because I think the characters are the primary focus of every story, and sometimes you listen to an episode where you feel like the actual narrative is driving the episode rather than the interactions with the characters. But with both stories so far, the characters have played such an integral role, and whilst that may seem a basic for storytelling, I think often characters, particularly support characters, can get lost within that story. Whilst here it feels like Alison and Stuart's rather troubled relationship is pushing that narrative forward, is changing the way the events flow. Likewise, the involvement of Ianto within the story, he's like this powerful figure which then raises questions of his rather ominous organisation that I absolutely love that Alison already knows about exists, which is the ongoing gag with Torchwood because they basically brand everything. But then we have that question of authority in there as well. Should he step in? How should he step in? But of course, Molly being at the centre of this, whilst not really revealing too much, I think the episode raises so many questions and therefore it takes the listener on that journey, which I thoroughly enjoyed exploring. Another good one. Next month we have Torchwood Disco, the final of the Ianto-ogy, and I'm really looking forward to see what that episode has to offer. I believe it's quite the character piece digging into Ianto's past, which feels a fitting way to conclude this trilogy of stories. And then there's no doubt more exciting stuff on the way later this year as well from this series. I'm continuing to love this range. I think that it is so accessible to many different types of audio drama listener, and I recommend it to anyone if you've came from Doctor Who, if you especially like Torchwood on TV. But I also just recommend it to everyday people who simply want to hear a good story. So thank you very much for listening to this review. I hope you have enjoyed it. Do of course stay tuned on The Host Productions for regular Big Finish audio drama reviews covering the latest releases. Have a nice day. I shall see you all next time.